this computer. Perfect. One more person let in. Awesome. So once again, welcome to the 5th iteration of Dialed In with WeldWerks. We're diving into homebrewing, and the lovely individual we brought along to bring this world to life for you is none other than our very own Wade Meyer. Wade has worn a lot of hats for us over time, but we always knew that his talent and his place was on the brewing staff. And the reason for that is that if Wade gets into a hobby, no stopping him becoming an absolute pro at whatever it is, whether it's fixing up cars or home repair, any of that stuff. He's a well-read, articulate, erudite individual. And so we thought he'd be the perfect pick, not just because of all those qualities, but because he's been homebrewing for 11 years and has won over a couple of dozen different medals and competitions, including at the granddaddy of them all, the American Homebrew Association's National Homebrew Competition. So he's got some serious experience and a lot of trial and error behind him, so he can speak to pretty much any question you might have. So without further ado, I introduce to you Wade Meyer. And Wade, at the end of the day, besides those particular accolades, and I mean this in the most loving way possible, why the fuck should we listen to you? Why is Wade Meyer here to talk to us about homebrewing, and what do you bring to the table for everyone along with all that experience?
Welcome everybody. Cheers. I'm drinking Pilsner Quell, probably my favorite beer of the year so far from WeldWerks. Best lager we've ever made by far, and it's fantastic. But I would say part of the reason why I have a unique point of view, it's not uncommon for homebrewers to become pros, but it is uncommon for homebrewers to become pros and then still homebrew. It's one of those things where you do it as your day job, you kind of lose love for it. I haven't lost love for homebrewing. I still homebrew quite often. It's nice because I can do stuff we don't do at WeldWerks. But yeah, so I would say that. And I do everything. I've brewed sours. I've got a sour program at home, lagers, stouts, everything. So I can pretty much attest to pretty much everything. A disclaimer on this whole series, this is kind of an overview. There's tons about brewing that I won't get into because I don't know everything, and it's very hard to hit every single subject in depth. But thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Wade. So, and kind of to his point as well, there's a lot to cover, especially on the intro side. And so if we are cruising through, we want to be respectful of everyone's time. We're going to cruise through as much as we can and keep it sharp and succinct. We can go over a little bit if we need be, answer some questions and whatnot. But if it actually comes that we're just diving into the weeds and people are crazy about what's going on here, we can always divide this up into 2 sessions, do another one at some other point, beginner side of things or the intro side of things, just FYI. So no rush. Let's just kind of wade in, no pun intended, wade into the water slowly and kind of see what comes out. Wade, one of the questions I wanted to grab off of the list that was submitted by our lovely attendees here was from Daniel Burst. What are the recommendations, just as a starting point, for batch size when you're initially getting started?
Yeah, so that's a perfect question because that's really where you're going to start. Is what size of batch, like what batch size do you want to do? There's a couple different options out there. You can pretty much make beer at any size you want. I know people that do half-gallon, 1-gallon systems, and I know people that do 3 gallons or 3-barrel systems, so 100 gallons almost. In my opinion, you're wasting your time if you're not doing a 5-gallon system or less. The time that you put into it is not that much greater it's not that much greater from 1 gallon, say, to a 5-gallon. And at the end of the day, if you make 1 gallon of beer, you're making a 12-pack. So 5 gallons is a good starting point. It is a little bit intimidating because you do have, it's a larger volume. But that's pretty much what the homebrew community has decided is the standard. It's in 5-gallon increments. So you either make 5 gallons, 10 gallons, or 15 gallons. It's pretty normal. And then up from there, you become more experienced and more nano. So I would recommend a 5-gallon batch size. You're going to find a lot easier and a lot more affordable to find stuff that meets that size. Just because if you try and find 1-gallon carboys and stuff, they're just going to be a little bit, they're not going to be distinctly purpose built for that. You're going to be using 1-gallon fermenters that are just 1-gallon jugs versus, a 5-gallon carboy or a 5-gallon bucket. They're just a lot easier to use that.
Got it. One question that actually leads directly, we just got it live from Justin, that leads actually directly into our next topic as well. We're going to dive into some equipment questions as far as what your basic starting equipment is. But Justin asks, is there a homebrew kit that you would recommend for us to start with, or do you recommend kind of doing the extra necessary research or whatever it is that you might be telling us about equipment to kind of piece something together? And again, we probably have folks that are at different budget levels. I'm sure we have folks that have different levels of like, I don't know, maybe I just want to give it a shot, see if I even like it, if it's something I want to keep doing. So with that in mind, it's kind of like ready to go sort of thing that that would help people dive into it, maybe brew a batch just to see if they dig it, then they could move on? Or do you recommend just saying, fuck it, like get this, and this, it's not that much more expensive? And, is that kind of the case?
So to figure out if you actually like homebrewing or not, the main thing I would recommend is look on the AHA, the American Homebrewers Association website, and find a local club. There's pretty much clubs everywhere. And what I would recommend is reach out to that club and see if you can come and brew with someone else. Chances are they're going to say yes. The number one thing that I've met with homebrewers is they love sharing their experience with people. They love having people come to them and kind of involve themselves in that to grow this community. I mean, the community in the last 3 years has really seen a downturn. But since this whole coronavirus stuff has come up, it's really seen a boost, which is great. But yeah, that's the number one thing. Is if you don't know if you really want to spend the money or you're really budget minded, reach out to local people. Because one, you're gonna be able to go and hang out with them and meet people, which is huge, and use their equipment. And maybe they'll give you a couple beers or whatever for helping out. But the other thing you're really gonna do is meet those people that maybe they have some used equipment that they're ready to offload. I mean, that's pretty much how I built most of my system, is finding people that were either getting out of the hobby or just didn't use it or tuning pro, and they had a bunch of equipment that I bought. So that's one of those things that for very budget-minded people, I would recommend reaching out to your local clubs and getting in touch with them and seeing if you can brew with someone else. As far as if you're ready to just buy brand new equipment, I mean, there's a lot of places you can buy online. Northern Brewer, Midwest Brew Supplies. There's a bunch of places. I mean, you can kind of just more beer. There's a bunch of places you can just kind of Google. Northern Brewer used to not be one of my favorites because they were owned by AB InBev. But they recently, I think it was last year, they sold that portion, so they're no longer owned by Anheuser-Busch. But what I would recommend, especially in the times that we're in now, is support your local homebrew shop. Small businesses that really have seen a downturn. I mean, we went from Northern Colorado having 5 or 6 homebrew shops down to 2 and almost 1, or almost none actually. So it's really important to support your local community and support your local businesses. So I would recommend that. And then in that front, you're really going to help. They're going to be your experts. They're going to know what they're talking about, and they're going to steer you in the point or in the direction that is best for you. If that makes sense. As far as bare bones equipment that you're going to need, we're kind of going to go through this beginner step. There's 3 different ways you can brew. So you can do an extract brew, which is all liquid or dried malt extract, or you can do partial match, which is kind of a mixture of using specialty grains and extract, or you can just go all in and use all grain. So we're going to go through that, but I'll start off with like the bare bones equipment that you're going to need no matter what. So you're going to need a boil kettle, whether that be your pot at home or buying out and buying a dedicated a dedicated boil kettle. So what I would recommend is, no matter what batch size you're doing, definitely give yourself some space to boil. If you get a 5-gallon pot, basically, when you put 5 gallons in it, you're all the way up to the brim. So when you boil, you're going to boil it over, because as liquid heats up, it expands. So I would definitely give yourself a couple gallons. For a 5-gallon system, I would recommend eight gallons roughly for a boil kettle. There's a lot of debate whether aluminum kettles are good or not. I think they're fine for beginners. I would prefer to use stainless, but I don't think there's anything wrong with it. So a turkey fryer from your local home store is a pretty good option, because 1, it comes with a burner, and 2, it comes with a 10-gallon pot usually, or a bigger pot. But they are aluminum typically. But to get into it, it's not a bad place to start. You're also going to need a fermenter. So with fermenters, you have a range of options. So starting from the most basic is a food-safe plastic bucket. There's pros and cons to each. They're extremely cheap, but they do allow more oxygen ingress to them because they are porous, and if you get an infection, they're pretty much useless. But they are a great place to start. And I know plenty of people that make really, really good beer with buckets. The next place is probably the most popular, and that's a glass carboy. Carboys are typically used for water, but they're pretty much easily found for $20 to $30. And they've got a narrow neck, which kind of is a pain to clean, but they do work very well. And I brewed in glass carboys for probably like 7 years. And then you've also got plastic carboys on that end as well. And there's some that are made that have wide mouths, so you can get in and clean them very easily. And there's some that are just basically plastic water bottles. Those also work as well. And then the lastly, and probably the most advanced, would be stainless steel. You've got the brew buckets that are kind of like conicals, but not really, because they don't have a bottom dump. And those are great. And then you also have the conicals, which have a bottom dump, that are more cost prohibitive. They're about $600-700 for a starting point. So it really depends on where you want to go. But for this, like a plastic bucket that's made for home brewing, you're gonna do great in. A glass carboy is gonna do fine. So you're gonna need that. You're also gonna need some chemicals. There's the main thing that I'm gonna stress when it comes to brewing is sanitation. So the main thing that I've seen with entry-level homebrewers is that they use their sanitizer, but sanitizer and cleaner are not the same thing. So in order to sanitize things, they have to be clean. If you put sanitizer on top of stuff that's not clean, you're gonna have a bunch of residue that will infect your beer. So what I would recommend is pretty much the standard is PBW. It's made by 5-Star Chemicals. And that's a cleaner. It's not a sanitizer. So that's going to break down any organic matter, and it's going to clean it really well to where you can then sanitize it. And then after you've cleaned it, you want to use Star San, which is pretty much the industry standard. There's a lot of other things that you can use as well. Some people used to use diluted bleach, which is, there's pros and cons to it. It's very cheap, but also you can ruin a beer with too much bleach. There's iodophor or iodine-based sanitizers, which are rinse and a no rinse. So I just prefer Star San. It's relatively cheap. It is a foaming sanitizer. So a lot of people want to rinse that foam out. There's a phrase, don't fear the foam. Star San breaks down into a yeast compound that the yeast can consume. So I wouldn't worry too much about the foam. I never did, and I've never had an issue with it. You're also going to need a way to package your beer. So whether that be bottles or kegs, or that's pretty much the only two, but bottles or kegs. So with bottles, you're going to need bottles. There's a lot of people that will use leftover bottles from commercial breweries, which is great. You definitely want to use ones that are press cap fit and not the screw tops. The screw tops will leak. But you can find those, rinse them in some water, and it'll strip all the labels off, clean them with some caustic or PBW, and then sanitize them, and they'll do fine. With that, you'll need caps. You'll need brand new caps and a capper, relatively cheap. Or you can move into kegging. And kegging is nice because instead of filling 50 bottles, you only have to fill one big bottle. But then you have to have a place to keep that keg, and some CO2 to dispense it and some other stuff that goes with that. The last thing you'll need is some ingredients. Typically, you'll buy ingredients as a kit with a recipe that you want to use, or you'll use a recipe builder to then decide what you want to buy, so to speak. So yeah, that's pretty much it for what you'll need.
Thank you, brother. We did have a quick question from Bad Astronaut 13. Is there a limit to how many times you can use a bucket if it is undamaged?
So the main thing you're going to look at for issues with buckets is going to be scratches. And those scratches are going to harbor places for bacteria. So what I would recommend is never use like a Scotch-Brite pad. So like there's the sponge with the green scrubby pad on it. Every time you scratch that, you're going to make a little indent in that bucket, which the yeast or any bacteria can then harbor in. So pretty much once a bucket's infected, once your batch turns bad, I would throw the bucket away. But as far as like if you keep it clean and you don't scratch it, no, there's not any uses that you can use it over and over and over. You will have some breakdown of the plastic over time. It's just the nature of plastic. But yeah, you can use it over and over.
Awesome. You started mentioning kind of the differences between your extract versus your partial mash versus all grain. Me as the guy who did a few homebrew batches, extract side was like, no, I'm good. I'm just going to stay to buying and enjoying and sensory evaluating beer. How can you speak to those differences between the extract, the partial mash, and the all grain? Is it worth going all in on all grain? What efficiencies might be had from doing one versus the other? Is this also a situation where one is better to do to start off just to kind of get your feet wet? How do you look at those three categories?
Yeah, so with extract, it's hard because you're using a commercial wort basically. So when they make a liquid or a dried malt extract, they're taking wort that they produce that has no hops in it or very little hops, and then they are boiling or they're condensing it down into either a syrup for liquid, so they're removing that water that's in there, or they're reducing it even more into a powder for dried malt extract. And so your job is basically just to rehydrate that. With that comes a couple of things. So you have the benefit of no match whatsoever. Literally bring a bucket full or a kettle full of water up, add some liquid malt extract to dilute it, or some dried malt extract to dilute it, and then reconstitute it, and you're done. And then you're ready to go. So there's a huge time savings with that. With that comes kind of a trade-off where you have a typical homebrew flavor. We've all kind of known what it is where you can taste it. It's everyone's using a similar extract, and it just kind of has this flavor that isn't very, it's not very fresh, it's not very good. But it still makes good beer, don't get me wrong. Like I used extract for a solid 3 years before I went to all grain. And you can do some things like with partial mash where you use that extract, but then you also add some fresh grain in it, some specialty malts that will amp it up, give it a little bit of freshness, give it a little bit of diversity, and you can then make a better beer out of that. And there's no more equipment required. The only thing for partial mash is you need a muslin sack, which is like $1 at the homebrew store. They're disposable, kind of like nylon sacks, and you're just going to steep that like a tea bag, and then add your liquid malt after that. And then there's really to move from extract to partial mash is not that much of a difference. You're talking a couple bucks for each batch. To move to all grains, to move to an all grains system, it's a substantial investment. A lot of people are very weary of it because they don't really understand it on what you're actually doing, or they don't understand like the equipment that is necessary, or if it's even worth it. I would say it is worth it, just because you're making beer the way that everyone else makes beer commercially, and it does taste better. You have way more control on a all grain system versus a partial mash or an extract system. But there is added equipment such as a mash tun. You can go the cooler route, which is probably the most popular. So you get a 5 to 8 gallon cooler if you're doing a 5 gallon batch size from Home Depot or wherever. and add a bazooka tube. It's kind of like a little screen mesh at the bottom. And you can do it that way, where you have a mash tun and then a boil kettle. There's also a relatively new, it's probably like 5 years old now, called Brunabag, where you actually have a giant muslin sack or a giant brew sack that you put the water in your kettle, and you use the mash tun or use the boil kettle as a mash tun as well. So you will have the sack in your kettle, fill it with grain, put the water in it, and then use that and just pull the grain out of that, and you're done. So brew in a bag systems are relatively easy. You can definitely go from an extract to a brew in a bag if you have the right size kettle, very easily. So the main important thing when I tell people like how you should spec out your homebrew system is get a bigger kettle than you think you need. Kettles are expensive. Even like a 10 or 15 gallon kettle is $100. So get a bigger kettle than you think you need, because if you go to a brew in a bag and you want to upgrade, it's very easy to do it. You're already ready. Whereas if you had a 5 gallon kettle, you're kind of pigeonholed into what you can do with it.
By the way, I gotta give you props. Literally 37 seconds after someone typed, "Can you touch on the disadvantages for beer in a bag?" You literally touched immediately on them. So I don't know if you're just reading people's minds or what, but there was a question. Curious. I'm sure everyone's heard of it or seen it or what have you. It is from Justin again, saying, "I've had some people talk to me about this Pico Brew thing." He's like, I think it seems like an easy way. What's your opinions on Pico Brew and using something like that for quote unquote?
Yeah, so the Pico Brew is a very interesting product. So they have I consider it an all-in-one. So there's the Grainfather, which is a little bit better than a Pico Brew as far as like your ability to change stuff. The Pico Brew is a great system. I kind of consider it the Keurig of brewing, because you have to buy their ingredient packs, but it is very automated, and that automation comes with a price. You can buy, if you change it to coffee, you can buy a really cheap French press and have full control, or you buy a espresso machine and it's fully automated, but it's quite expensive. It's kind of that style where you plug this grain pack in and it will spit out beer pretty much. So it's a good system if you're looking for kind of like a hands-off approach, or a very minimal approach, where if you have a busy lifestyle, kids and whatnot, it's a great idea for that. I mean, any brewing is better than no brewing in my opinion. So a Pico Brew is a good option. I think it is cost prohibitive for what you actually get from it, but it is a good option for people that are either time sensitive or knowledge sensitive, where they don't really they kind of want a more hands-off approach. I think it is a great option.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Okay, so let's start diving into a brew day, right? You got all your shit together. Maybe you got your recipe, you got your ingredients, you got the idea of what you want to do, and now you've just got a bunch of shit in front of you. So what does brew day look like? And on top of that, again, I'm speaking from very limited experience, but I do remember it being clusterfuck, just like, I don't know, like exactly, like kind of like putting together. I am an avid cook. I do remember that first feeling of trying to put together a somewhat complicated recipe and just being overwhelmed by the timing of those steps, what that kind of all looks like. How do you break that down into something that is simple and easy to be like, kind of like, the Douglas Adams "don't panic" sort of thing? How do you break that down easily, and how do you make a first or even second or third brew day go off, maybe not without a hitch, but at the very least without a lot of stress and a lot of like, shit, what have I done?
Gotcha. So the first thing, and pretty much everyone on here has probably heard it, is relax, don't worry, have a homebrew. That's kind of a mantra that is put out a lot through the homebrewing community, and it's great. I mean, at the end of the day, if you can boil water, you can make beer. It's not that hard. So the first thing you're going to do is clean. you have to have clean equipment. So whether that be your fermenter, your boil kettle, you're really going to want to make sure that everything is clean and ready to go. The next thing that I would do is get your water together. So if you are doing an extract, that's probably the best way to do it. Is we're going to focus on how to do wort, how to, like, each step on all three of those, how to make your wort. So with extract, you're going to bring your water up to temperature, and you're going to add your liquid extract, and you're done. You're going to bring it up to a boil, and you've already got wort. As far as partial mash, I used to steep my partial mash grains at about 150 for about 15 minutes. And with that, with specialty grains, especially darker grains, you don't really do any conversion. So you don't need to do a full mash rest. You're just kind of steeping it for color, more or less. So you'll bring up some water to 150, take your muslin sack that's kind of like a tea bag with its grain in it, and steep it like a tea bag, dunk it, and just kind of get some of that, and then add your extract to it, and you're there. You've got wort. With all grain, it becomes much more complicated. So you're going to have to do a strike temp, which is just the same thing, bringing up your water to the temperature you want. Usually it's above what you actually want to do. So with strike temperature, you want to be between 148 and 152 typically. There are some outliers of that, but on a single infusion mash, that's pretty typical. So you're going to bring that up to temperature, add your grain, stir it all together, and make sure you don't have any dough balls. And then you're going to do a saccharification rest for typically about an hour is what the books usually tell you. I don't find that incredibly necessary. At WeldWerks, we do a 15-minute mash rest. Granted, our mash out is 45 minutes. It takes that long, or 20 to 45 minutes to get it up to temp, so it's still converting during that. But I've even on my homebrew system done 15-minute mash rests, and it's worked out fine. There's very little efficiency loss, especially negligible for a homebrewer. So if you're looking for ways to cut some time off your brew day, I would recommend cutting down your mash time. So you're going to have this mash that's at 150 degrees, say. Then you're going to want to mash out, which is bringing it up to temperature to about 168 to 172. And if you have a cooler, you're going to do an infusion mash where you're going to add some hot water. Or if you have a system where you can add some heat to it, you're going to add that heat and bring it up that way. So then you're going to have it at 160. You're going to do what's called a boil off. Basically, you're going to take very slowly some wort out of the bottom of the mash tun and add it to the top. And that's going to compress the grain bed and kind of make like a grain filter is what we're looking to do here. And then you're going to start the sparge. So there's multiple ways to sparge. There's batch size sparging, which is basically you drain the whole thing. You have your full amount of water in there. You're going to drain it all into your kettle and you're done. Then you have what's called batch sparging, where you're going to do the same thing, but then you're going to add more water and then stir it all together, re-boil off, and then drain that, and you're done. There's benefits to both. I batch sparge for a really long time until I have a hot liquor tank. But I think that the fly sparging, which is the last method, is probably the best as far as like rinsing the grain. So that you have to have another vessel holding hot water, and you have to, as you're pulling off, add water on top, which will then rinse through the grain bed. I feel like you get a little bit better efficiency, and you have quite a bit more control doing a fly sparge. But any way you do it is fine, to be honest. So now you have wort in your kettle, right? So what do you do with that? So you're going to add some hops, and you're going to start boiling. And so with that, there's probably the biggest thing that confused me when I was starting was the hop schedule. Because of the way that brewers write recipes, it has a minute added next to the hops. So it'll be like 60-minute, 15-minute, whatever. That you would think would be like, okay, this many minutes into the boil, I add that. It's the opposite. It's how long are they in there? It's more of a countdown than a timer. And so when you're doing bittering hop addition, there's two ways you can do it. You can do a first wort hop, where you actually add hops to the kettle before you actually start draining off wort. That leads to a little bit more rounder bitterness, which is great. And I typically do it that way because you have an added benefit of having hop boils in the wort where you don't have as crazy of boilovers. because you will have boilovers as a home brewer. It's just a common thing. And then the other thing is you can bring all your wort in, have a full volume, start the boil, add your hops, and that's your first addition. Typically, it's a bittering hop. And so, yeah, then you'll go through your boil. Typically, you'll boil from 60 minutes to 90 minutes, depending on what you're brewing. If you have a lot of Pilsner malt in it, I recommend a 90-minute. Where we are in elevation, I boil for 75 minutes because we boil at 205 degrees instead of the normal 60, just to drive off a little bit more. But you're going to boil through that time. And as you get later in the boil, the hops you add are going to add less bitterness and more aroma.
Hey, wait, very quickly, before we dive into some more of that, want to take one small trip backwards. Not a big one, just a small one. Let's maybe, just for sake of clarity and for ease, make sure that everybody's on the same page. There are some words and some terminology and some phrasing that we're using that if you are absolutely new to brewing are like, what the fuck is wort? Like, I tried some like weird acid on my finger the other day, and like I sure as fuck don't want that in my beer, sort of deal, right? So, let's talk about. I think grain is relatively clear. It's the one of the main parts of the beer that we use to impart its flavor and also to deliver some of the sugar. But what is wort? What does it mean to mash or to create a mash? What is the mash, as it were? So some of those things that might that seem a little bit esoteric if you haven't heard them before. And so besides those two specifically, if there's any others you can think of that maybe someone hearing them for the first time might not be sure what they are.
Yeah. So wort is, to put it simply, unfermented beer. It's beer that is very high in sugar, and it's not technically beer yet because you haven't added yeast. So that's wort. It's just sugar water, more or less. As far as
let me dig down one more on that. Wort. Finish this sentence for me. Wort is created when you
extract sugars from grain.
So by the process of steeping the grain in water.
Yeah. So
the temperature, etc.
Yeah. So the mash, what it does is it actually, you're at a certain temperature, you're activating natural enzymes in the grain that convert the carbohydrates of that grain into sugar. And that's what we're after. So that, when I say efficiency, is how effective are you at converting those carbohydrates into sugar that the yeast can then ferment. And that same thing applies for extract because it's already been done for you. You still have that sugar from grain. You're just diluting it down. And then a mash is literally just grain and water. That's a mash. And then a sparge is the act of adding water to a mash to rinse the sugars out.
Thank you, sir. And folks, keep those types of questions coming if there are any. We don't. There is absolutely zero assumption here whatsoever about where you are in your brewing process.
Okay.
There's no such thing as a bad question. If for any reason you'd like to just ping me directly, you can just hit WeldWerks team with the question, and I can just bring that to everybody on your behalf. But there truly is anything that you're curious about. We want to make sure that those are answered in a way that that is clear and available and to everyone. So we left off at bittering hops, I believe, correct?
Yeah. So we've got this kettle full of wort, and we've got our bittering hops in. So now we're going to boil it, or it's already ready and boiling. So one tip that I have that has helped me over the years is you're going to have these boilovers. So until you hit hot break, which is basically where the proteins coagulate and it starts to almost simmer instead of like rapidly boiling, you're going to have it's foam, it's proteins that raise to the top of the kettle, and they're going to boil over. And if you're on a home kitchen, it really sucks. So one tip that I have is there's a product by 5-Star called Firm Cap. I believe it's 5-Star, but Firm Cap is great. It's basically a food grade silicone. And what that does is it keeps that protein from happening. It keeps it flat. So firm cap is great, or if you really don't want to go out and buy another chemical, or you don't feel comfortable adding food grade silicone to your beer, you can add just water, a spray bottle like this, full of water, just spritz it on as it's going. It's better than killing your boil. So when you kill your boil and you turn off the heat to it, you're kind of prolonging the inevitable. Whereas if you're adding water, it kind of knocks down that foam. So that's a great tip for people that don't know it, to kind of keep the mess down as far, especially if you're burning indoors. And if you're on a glass stovetop, like that is the worst as far as that. And as far as burning on a glass stovetop, that's how I started out in my mom's kitchen, was brewing on this glass stovetop, and it took forever to heat up. So really, if you have a glass stovetop, I would recommend getting a turkey fryer and a propane tank and brewing outdoors, because the amount of time you're going to save is incredible. I mean, I remember it taking almost an hour just to get it up to a boil, versus like a propane tank and the turkey fryer will do it in like 10 minutes. So yeah, that's one thing. So we're boiling, right? So we're boiling our wort down. We're reducing the water that's in it and condensing the sugars down, basically. So we're going to add some hops during there typically. It depends on what you're brewing, though. The recipe may call for it. If you're brewing a Juicy Bits clone, you're not going to add it any more than first wort during the boil. You're not going to add any more hops whatsoever. But if you're brewing a West Coast IPA, you're going to add quite a bit. The longer it's in the boil, the more bitterness you're going to extract and the less aroma. Think of it as it's boiling off, you're boiling off those aromas. You're also boiling off some off flavors from the grain, which is great, but you're still going to lose the aromas from the hops. So as you go, the more it's in there, the more bitter it is. So typically you'll see like a 60, a 30, and a 15, and then a flame out or a whirlpool edition. That's pretty typical for like an old school recipe, maybe not the whirlpool. But on like newer stuff, you'll see no boil edition besides the first wort, and then it's literally just all whirlpool. So yeah, once we're there, we're at the end of the boil.
Awesome. One thing that we didn't really get into as well, which I think needs to be touched on relatively significantly, is the level of sanitation. And Brandon Zielinski asked this in the sheet, or when signing up. Interested in what level of sanitation you think is necessary and what you do to accomplish it along the way, just given how important cleanliness and sanitation is along the way.
Gotcha. So up until this point, sanitation, while it's important to keep clean equipment, is relatively not an issue because you're still boiling. Boil will kill everything. After we cool down the beer or the wort, it's extremely important. It's probably it is the number one important thing. If you have dirty equipment after you cool down the wort, or cold side as we call it, you're going to have infected beer, which will be bad. So there's a couple ways. So we're done boiling now. There's a couple ways that you can use to chill this wort down. Because if you just put yeast on top of boiling water, it'll kill all the yeast and you'll have nothing. So you can do what's called a no-chill method, where you basically just put it in your fermenter, let it sit for a day, it'll naturally come down, and then you can pitch your yeast. A lot of people do that very successfully. I've never done that because I've always either done the other things, which you can do an ice bath just in your kitchen sink. That does take quite a bit of time, but it does work. You can also do an immersion chiller, which is very, very popular. It's basically a copper or stainless coil that you put in the kettle at like 15 minutes left in the boil to sanitize it in the beer or in the wort. And then you'll run cold water through your sink or through a garden hose to cool that down. That works extremely well. You can cool down in about 5 to 10 minutes for a 5-gallon batch, and it works very well. On the more advanced side, you have what's called plate chiller, which is what commercial breweries use, or a heat exchanger. It's basically like a radiator, and you'll have different plates, and in between those plates will alternate cold water with hot beer or hot wort. And then you have a counterflow, which is kind of like a tube inside of a tube for an immersion chiller, where you have the hot wort going inside one tube and cold water surrounding that tube. So those are pretty much the only ways to cool your wort down. For a beginner, the ice bath is the easiest and cheapest way to do it, or the no-chill method. But after you are done boiling, sanitation is 100% important. And that's when the star sand comes into contact, where you're going to need to use that for your fermenter.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. Also, kind of along those lines, Bad Astronaut said he's read things discouraging stirring in an ice bath. Do you have thoughts on that? And similarly, can it take too long to chill it to temp? Is there such a thing there?
So we'll start with the stirring. With stirring, what I've seen is mostly like a lack of sanitation. So you're going to have a dirty spoon or a spoon that hasn't been properly sanitized that can then infect the wort. Or a lot of people will nitpick on oxidation at this point. So it's oxygen in there that they think will then stale the beer. I would point out that yeast really need oxygen especially in their initial stage, to grow. And so any oxygen that you have in your wort at this point is nothing but good for the beer. On a more advanced scale, you're actually going to add oxygen to your beer. And even on this scale, you're going to shake the crap out of your fermenter once it's in there to get some more oxygen in there for the yeast to actually replicate. So I don't think that stirring is a bad thing. I think that as long as you properly do it with sanitized equipment, you're going to move that cool liquid along the outside of the pot and kind of more evenly disperse it. So instead of having a hot center, you're going to have it more evenly and it'll cool a little bit quicker. Being in Colorado, I've also used a snowbank to cool beer in the middle of winter. I've literally just taken my pot with a lid on it, put it in a snowbank, and came back a couple 30, 40 minutes later, and it was cool. So there's a lot of ways to cool beer.
Awesome. Had a few mentions on your side about whirlpooling. Maybe a quick definition for folks who are unaware, and also if that's something that you suggest on your side as well.
Yeah. So whirlpooling is the act of spinning the beer in the kettle. So what that does is while you're whirlpooling, you can add hops, which you're not boiling it, so you're going to get quite a bit of aroma. But the benefit of it, and where it really becomes important, is you're actually taking all these proteins that you've boiled and collected and kind of coning them up in the middle. So it kind of brings everything from a sludge at the bottom or mixed in with the beer and lets it cool down in a cone where you can then grab it from the side. So a whirlpool is literally a whirlpool. It's found in nature where it's a hole in the bottom where it kind of spins. It's spinning liquid, basically. So whirlpool is used for hop additions as well as coning up the trub, so to speak. And trub is basically the proteins from the grain that you boiled out.
Awesome. Some additional questions just about temperature. Can you get your beer too cold when chilling it down? And is there a maximum temperature range for aerating the wort?
So as far as the too cold aspect, you're basically going to prolong the yeast starting. So you're going to have, if you're too cold, the yeast will they won't die, they'll just become inactive. And so what you're going to do is just prolong that yeast fermentation. As far as, wait, what was the second question? Sorry.
Is there a maximum temperature range for aerating wort?
Oh, gotcha. For temperature, the colder a liquid is, the better it absorbs a gas. So whether that be CO2 when you're kegging or bottling or whatever, the colder it is, it will absorb it faster. So if you try and aerate a boiling hot wort, it's not going to uptake as much oxygen as a colder one. That being said, typically when I oxygenate, it's already at pitching temp, which is 100% dependent on your yeast strain. If you're brewing a lager, I typically cool mine down to about 55 degrees, which is my fermentation temperature for lagers. If I'm brewing an ale, it's going to be 67. Is pretty much what I ferment at ales. And just to touch base on the difference between lagers and ales, it's a yeast strain. So lagers and ales are two different types of yeast. lagers are going to be a bottom fermenting yeast, and typically cleaner and crisp. Think of your Bud Lights, think of your Pilsner or Quells, think of stuff like that where it's clean and crisp and very little flavor as far as like what the yeast provide. Ales are going to be a top fermenting yeast strain, so they're going to sit on top of the wort and ferment on top, and they're going to be hotter fermenting so they can handle higher temperatures without producing off flavors. And they're also going to create more flavorful beer as far as like what you're looking for. Does that make sense? But yeah, so as far as temperature, really I would just cool down to whatever yeast strain you're brewing with to do that.
Got it. So we kind of, well, one of the things that we didn't quite get to, I think we hit hops for the most part. We want to be sampling throughout the process, and then also kind of maybe tie into that. How often and when during the home brewing process are we going to be grabbing gravity readings as well?
Right. So we'll start off with gravity. What does gravity mean? Basically, what gravity means is it's a scale based on water, which is 1, of how much sugar is in that liquid. And based on that, you're going to have 2 main readings that are the most important, which is going to be final gravity and original gravity. Original gravity is going to be how much sugar is in it pre-fermentation, so before the yeast actually eat all that sugar and create alcohol. And the second is going to be your final gravity, which is going to be after it's completed, how much residual sugar is left in that beer. The results of the final gravity are going to have a huge difference on how much alcohol you have, obviously, as well as how much body the beer has. The more sugar that's left in a beer, the more body it feels like it has in your mouth. So like with Noche, so our Media Noche series, that one starts, and I'm going to speak professional brewer, which is Plato. That starts at 40 Plato, which is relatively high on a homebrew scale. I believe that's like 1300, so 1.300. And then it ferments out to about 19 Plato, which is like 1070, I believe, which is typically your starting gravity for, say, like Noche. So that kind of puts that in perspective, like the difference between, or not Noche, Juicy Bits. So the difference between Noche is it finishes at what Juicy Bits starts. So that's, when you have those readings, what you're going to be able to find out is how much alcohol is in the beer, which is important to some, important to, or at least less important to others. If you're just making beer to drink, you don't really have to take gravity readings. Like, it is what it is. But it's going to help you in the long run to know, to dial in your recipes and to know where you're at, and to say, this is a 6% beer and I know what I'm getting into, versus like, this beer is 4%. You can also figure out what, if you have any issues, like if you have stalling out where the yeast will stop fermenting at a certain point, you can figure out what that point is, and you can kind of diagnose it from there. So the main 2 things are for taking gravity readings is going to be your starting and finishing gravities. You also can take them on your mash side to figure out what your efficiency is, but that's kind of more advanced. As far as a beginner, I would really just worry about my starting gravity after the boil and my finishing gravity after fermentation.
Thank you, sir. So we are at a point where we should kind of ask the question. So we still have to get through for this one, as far as we're concerned, fermentation, which is no small beast, bottling and kegging, and then a really significant question that we loved from David, which small mistakes in brewing can cause the biggest ripples downstream in the end product. And then also just talking about kind of resources, where to get help. So plus we also have questions coming in on the side. I don't know if anybody has or where you have a preference either way. If we want to try and just fly through all of those, that is a lot of information to try and fly through, given some of the importance of some of those issues, including another great question that was in there, how to brew with minimal equipment and space. Do we just kind of keep taking questions along these lines, and then maybe say that will kind of amend the course of the courses and maybe do like a beginner part 2 or an intro part 2, or do we want to just kind of charge through and just kind of see how far we can get in the next, I don't know, 15 or 20 minutes and kind of push off the live questions for now? Any preference?
I'm fine with whatever. If you want to fly through them, we can get through it pretty quick.
I just think that there's you have a lot of insight, and there's a lot of detail that you can go into with some of these things, and I'd rather not short shrift. And there's some stellar questions continuing to come in, right? So why don't we just maybe take some live questions? We're going to go over as it is, right? So let's we kind of hang out, take questions. We can take fermentation, bottling, etc. after the fact. If people want to hang out for a little while longer, continue to ask questions. And that's one of the best things with Wade is that he just the breadth of knowledge is really wide. So we can maybe call that like beginning part or the intro part 1 closed off as far as the curriculum goes. But just keep throwing questions out there, and we'll answer them for maybe, I don't know, Wade, if you're cool, another 15, 20 or so.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Itching. Being flexible with us, folks. This is a new thing for us. Obviously, we've never done a homebrew class. Sure as hell never done it online. So we're just kind of shooting from the hip as we go because we wanted to get the content out to everybody. And Wade and I knew that this would be a possibility. That there's just so much to go over starting out on a hobby like this. Holy crap! There's a lot more questions coming in. So let's just start rocking and rolling. Let's see here. We got there. We were there. So this is a good overall question from Justin that I think is to touch on a few different things. For you, was brewing tougher or easier than what you thought it was going to be when you first started?
I would say, well, it's kind of hard because does that mean going from homebrewing to professional, or does that just mean?
I think that means like on the homebrewing side. When you first started getting into making yourself.
I would say that homebrewing is a lot more cleaning than you think it is. It's a lot more stickier than you think it's going to be. Because
it's true about a lot of stuff, Wade.
You're dealing with sugar water. But it's not unreasonable. If you can brew water, you can make beer. It's one of those things where it's not that difficult. So I would say if you're trying to do it in a minimal space, like say you've got an apartment and you just don't want to make a mess, I wouldn't be intimidated by it. I think you could do it. It's not that much harder than making your own bread or doing anything like that. At the end of the day, you're boiling water and then you're adding yeast and you're letting it do its thing. So even if you make crappy beer, it's still beer at the end of the day. I mean, it'll still get you drunk.
Oh boy, he's speaking my language. Although I also drink Wort, so also, we did get a bunch of thumbs up from our lovely folks here for a part 2. So I think that's definitely the way to go. Let's keep rocking, though. A few questions about water. And I love the question, is Greeley water okay? Just for those who don't know, Greeley was actually in a national, there's a such thing as a national water competition, believe it or not. But Greeley actually placed, I think in 2017, if I remember correctly, first in the nation for overall water quality. We don't do, I mean, depending on the beer, Wade can go into this more, we don't do much to ours at all. So Wade, brewing at home, I mean, do you do anything at all to your water?
So this is quite a bit more advanced. I would put this in the advanced section, but for water chemistry and for doing anything with your water, the first thing you need to do is get a baseline. When I moved into my house, I used Ward Labs and they do a water test kit. The Lamont also makes a home test kit, but I prefer the Wards because you get a more detailed kit. However, that does come at the expense of you can't test it every time you want. I think it's like $40 or $50, but they basically send you a vial. You fill it up with your water that you're going to use, and then you send that out, and they give you the analysis back. One thing that I will recommend with that is your water changes over the course of the year. You're going to have different source materials depending on what your water treatment plant gets it from. Whether that be like in Greeley, we get ours from Horseshoe Reservoir or the river or a couple other places, and they're going to have a different treatment solution depending on the time of year. But what Jake said is absolutely correct. If you're in Colorado, your water is pretty much good. You don't really need to do much to it depending on what you're trying to brew. If you're trying to brew a pretty classic style, you might want to add, like if you're trying to brew a West Coast, you might want to add some gypsum, which will help with the hop characteristics. It'll bring out more hops. But if you're trying to brew New England, you're going to want to add some more calcium chloride, which will make it a softer water. If you're out of California, however, your water is pretty damn hard. And so I would recommend getting some from the grocery store, basically. And so that will help you with having a better base to start with. The one thing you don't want to use is distilled water. It has no I can't think of the name right now. It has no minerals in it whatsoever. And so you're not going to it's going to be kind of bland. So you're going to want to add some of that back. So with water, it's pretty extensive where you can get. Water is the one thing that I will say will elevate your homebrew game. When I was brewing, I was just using tap water when I first started. And then when I finally got into water chemistry, it literally was a night and day difference on beers. And you can do them after the fact, after they've been brewed. You can add some calcium chloride or add some gypsum in a standard pint glass even, and that will give you the difference of what you're going to taste. So you can kind of do that where it'll show you what you're going to do even after the fact and show you the difference it makes.
Awesome. I got a fun question for you. I'm going to answer one very quickly on my own. Just a question: how does homebrewing, or how do you see homebrewing affecting businesses like yourself at WeldWerks? Wouldn't want to see homebrewing affect great breweries like WeldWerks, etc. It's certainly a valid question, but at the end of the day, we are completely forthcoming with our recipes, with our process, with the way that we do what we do. We published the recipe for Juicy Bits years ago. Not long after it was actually brewed for the first time and released to the public. And the reason for that is twofold. One, brewing is collaborative. This whole industry is collaborative, and it's actually one of the best parts. We're releasing 2 different collaborations. One of them got pushed off to next week. Our collab with the lovely folks from Speciation out in Comstock Park. But we're also releasing one from Trilha out in, not Trillium, Trilha out in Brazil. One of our favorite IPAs last year, Points of Light, where they sent one of their brewers from Brazil out to come and hang out with us just to learn and whatnot.
For like a month too. He was out here.
Yeah, for a long time, like an extended internship. And that is not an internship. He was a professional brewer, but like an extended exchange of information. But that guy had complete access to what we do, how we do it, why we do it. He hung out with Wade. He was a great dude. We welcome this sort of collaboration because at the end of the day, there's enough room for everybody. But when it comes to home brewing, and I say this with as little hubris as I possibly can, but if you can make better beer, go for it. Truly, we really mean that. I mean, we bust our ass to stay on top of every single part of the business and the ins and outs, the complexities of brewing, and we feel ultimately that we can offer something that you might not. Now, I had some incredible homebrews. Please do not get me wrong. I've stewarded homebrew competitions at specifically at Big Beers, which is one of the best competitions, in the country. And I've had beers there that will knock your socks off. I don't care if you're amateur, professional, best in the world, or what have you. But we're not. I guess I say that just to say we're not afraid of competition or afraid of someone taking what we've done and making it better. If you take what we have done and you do a better job at it, that's awesome. Like, I cannot express how happy that makes us feel, and we want to taste that beer. Send to us, man. Like, hey, I did this homebrewing class with Wade, and then I made this, Juicy Bits clone. Jason, let me know what you think. There's a good chance that, hey, maybe it's better than Juicy Bits. Awesome. Fantastic. That's the point. The point is that we all work on all of this stuff collaboratively together, and nobody's really ultimately competing against each other. If you want to come out and buy some of our 4-packs, great. If you can make a better version of what we have at home, great too. We do it because we love it. Neil started in a garage. He was never a professional brewer in any sense of the word. He just loved doing it, and it is just kind of organically grown into what it is now. No more, no less. So it's all open source as much as it can be, and we invite everybody to do their best version of whatever it is that we also can do and that anybody can do. And that's also the cool part of it. Anybody can do this shit. This isn't like high-level computer programming where you have to take like 4 years of classes to figure out how to write this thing or that thing. It is a completely accessible hobby whereby you can provide yourself a lot of happiness and fulfillment, and at the end of the day, just a delicious beer that gives you a nice buzz on a Friday or a Wednesday. So no, we don't feel any pressure or anything like that. We welcome everything about the homebrewing culture, and anything that you guys can do to make a better beer furthers the entire endeavor altogether. Kind of like, rising tide raises all boats sort of deal. So there was a couple other really great questions. Oh yeah, the fun one for you, Wade. What was your first big splurge, or your first I was phrased as really nice piece of equipment that you invested in?
So kind of what you alluded to earlier, when I take a hobby pretty seriously, I kind of jump all the way in.
Sure do.
So I had a pretty moderate setup, like a 10-gallon kettle. I had some coolers that my in-laws got me for Christmas. But then I got my system that I have now, which is a 20-gallon half-barrel system that I built myself. And so that one was kind of my big splurge. It's 2 20-gallon kettles for a mash tun and a boil kettle, a 15-gallon HLT, and then I built that brew stand myself. It's all tri-clamp, which is pretty awesome. It's got 2 Riptide pumps and a Blickman plate chiller on it, and it's propane for now. It'll probably go natural gas or electric in the near future. But I also have a conical and a bright tank and a glycol chiller. So I've kind of taken the full deep end as it is. And then I've also got a 10-tap kegerator, which is a little ridiculous, way too big for a normal person. But yeah, so I've kind of gone off the deep end when it comes to beer. It's pretty ridiculous. But I would say my first big splurge was my conicals.
What's the best way in general, as broadly as you can speak, to control fermentation temperatures?
I used to use a wet towel on top of the glass carboy, to kind of bring down that temperature. The evaporation effects kind of cooled it down quite a bit. That's a really good, anyone can do it way. The best way to get the precise method is going to be glycol, but it's pretty cost prohibitive.
Got it. Question from Paul about grain storage. If we're doing all grain brewing, well, actually two parts. How would you store grain, first of all, for all grain brewing, and how important is or isn't it to grind grain fresh for brewing, and or if you have any specific recommendations for equipment for that?
So for grain storage, what I use is Lowe's or Home Depot has these food safe buckets. They're 5-gallon buckets, and you can buy a gamma lid. Basically, it's a lid that's resealable and is oxygen proof. They're like all total, you're looking at like $7 for a 5-gallon bucket. That'll hold about 20 pounds of grain. Those are really great alternatives. Vitabolts are also a really good alternative. They're kind of like a dog food storage thing that's stackable. They're about $30, $45 for a whole bag. That's a 50-grain bag. Those are also great options. As far as milling, If you do it a couple days before, a day or two, 3 days, whatever, it's fine. Even at WeldWerks, we'll mill in on Friday for Monday. So it's going to sit there for the entire weekend, and we notice no differences. When I'm brewing at home, typically while my strike temperature, while my mash water is getting up to temp, I'll start milling in, or I'll start the grind. So it's not that important. I don't see that much of a difference. If you're going months on end or weeks on end, I would see some staleness happening. So I would say the fresher the better, but I wouldn't worry too much if you're going on a Friday and you're not going to brew till Sunday. I wouldn't worry too much
Got it. One more fun one, just, for the heck of it. What exactly are you pouring yourself there on that ridiculous kegerator of yours?
So I've got 10 taps. Like I said, I've got 9 CO2 and then 1 nitro. I've got a milk stout, 2 saisons, a sour, 2 pilsners, and a helles.
Is that it?
That's it.
Hey, folks. We'll probably start. Sorry, one last question from Ryan here. Can the grain lose a percentage of water here in Colorado, and will that matter when weighing the grain?
I'm sorry, what was that again?
Can the grain lose a percentage of water here in Colorado, and will that matter? So, will evaporation or what have you play a role in weighing the grain at all, or is that negligible enough that you don't have to worry about it?
Gotcha. So what I think he's asking is like, how much water will that grain soak up? It's quite a bit, actually. 2 softwares that I recommend is going to be Beersmith, which is what we use even at WeldWerks, and Brewer's Friend. And when you input that recipe, it's going to give you how much water you're going to need, because there's going to be some absorption rate. So that grain is going to absorb some of that water. So if you start out with 5 gallons exactly, you're not going to end up with 5 gallons of wort. And even if you start off with 5 gallons of wort in your kettle, you're boiling off about a gallon an hour on a typical homebrew setup. So you're going to end up with 4 gallons of wort, 4 gallons of finished beer, even less actually. So really you want to oversize your stuff. If your end product is to make 5 gallons of beer, you're going to want about 6.5 gallons in your kettle to start the boil. So really it's going to make a difference. The boil off rate in Colorado, just because of the altitude, we're not boiling as hot. I find it about roughly 1 gallon an hour. It's really hard. When you do your system, you're going to have to dial it in over batch. So it's really going to take some time, but you'll get there. And with Beersmith specifically, because I haven't really used Brewer's Friend that much, I typically just use Beersmith. You can input your own profile. So as you brew more batches, you can modify that profile, and it will spit out more and more accurate numbers.
Awesome. Folks, we are going to call it there. I think plenty more to go. Again, just to remind everybody, we are looking at fermentation. Big, huge deal. A lot of stuff to go over there, especially starting out. Bottling and kegging. Also a lot of ins and outs there. Kind of talking about small mistakes that can butterfly effect into bigger problems down the line. Then also talking about some additional resources and where to go when first starting out. I think what we'll probably end up doing, don't quote me on this, but most likely we will end up just putting the whole thing out a whole week. So if you folks hadn't heard, Wade, you can congratulate him right here and right now. His lovely wife is going to be induced this coming Tuesday for their second child being born into this world. So probably not the best idea for him to do a homebrew class on Wednesday. Well, yeah. I've just gone through the birthing process myself. Well, not physically myself, but with my wife. And so I think we're going to do next Friday instead. Next Friday from 7 to 8 p.m. I sent that out with the link that I sent out to everybody. And what I will do is just let everybody know on the whole list that will be intro part 2. So we'll go over all of that shit for intro part 2. So people who want to tune in can, who don't have to. I believe that is just about it. Thank you so much, tuning in. Wade, thank you so much as always for your knowledge and for sharing your time with us. We wish the best to you and your lovely lady in the coming days. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and hanging out with us, and we will continue to hang out and learn about fun shit together. And with that, it is time for the closing. Well, whiskey, a little bit of smoke wagon from the lovely people out in Las Vegas, Nevada. If you can get your hands on this shit, by the way, and you like whiskey, I swear to God, it's the best $30 bottle of whiskey I have had in years. So, cheers, friends. Hope you guys have a lovely rest of your week, and we'll catch you next week.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers, guys.
No limit.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Salud, amigos.
Cheers.